going here. Welcome, everyone, to today's Moss session. Today, we're going to be exploring the world of living fossils. We're going to be talking about gar and paddlefish and the management of those things in the modern world. We're joined today by the Minnesota DNR's Dr. Devin Oliver. He is a fisheries scientist based out of Lake City and has spent more than 20 years working on large river research and management, and has lots of fantastic information to share with us about these interesting fish. So with that said, let's turn it over to Dr. Oliver.
Not quite 20 years, but quite a bit. I got my start, and I'll give you a little background on me so you know where I'm coming from, in Western New York, where I grew up, about an hour south of Buffalo. I got my undergrad in Central New York from State University of New York, Cobleskill in fish and aquaculture. I did my master's in Louisiana, where I worked on blue suckers and the Pearl River, which is the boot tip of the river. I did my PhD at Southern Illinois River, where I worked on everything from silver and big egg carp, some pallid sturgeon, paddlefish stuff, sauger, walleye, catfish of various types. My PhD was on population demographics and native recruitment sources of catfish in the Ohio River. I worked for Arizona Game and Fish for nearly 5 years as a researcher there, where I did work on the Colorado River and the East Verde River, looking at Gila trout and rainbow trout. And I also did some invert work. And since 2022, I have been here working on the Mississippi River again, which I absolutely love, covering a myriad of native species, ranging from gar to catfish and paddlefish. So today I'm talking about living fossils and our modern management, gar and paddlefish in today's world. And functionally, this is a story of two fish, but it's really three. So we have long nose and short nose gar, but quite often people don't understand the difference of them. And then we have paddlefish, which are also unique and a little bit better known because of the way they look and their long history of management compared to gar, which have probably would have been better off left alone and ignored rather than managed historically. So what we're going to cover, oops, there we go, is a few things. We're going to talk about ancient fish, evolution, physiology, and kind of more anatomy, their biology. And we'll jump into fish history, the history of management, conservation of these species. We'll talk about the current global status in the US. We'll go on to a Minnesota focus, and then we'll talk a little bit about looking forward and what we're kind of doing in the DNR with a kind of a 10,000-foot overview of some of the things we have happening. So these are an ancient fish. On here is kind of like a rough timeline. Chondrichthyans, which you see up at the top, is sharks. So you can see they were super early evolved, 500 million years ago. That's what the MA at the bottom stands for, million years. For reference on here, dinosaurs went extinct about 66 million years ago. Gar and paddlefish, however, evolved somewhere between approximately 150 and 250 million years ago. So we're talking fish that existed or in some format, almost twice as long as the dinosaurs did. For additional reference, pike evolved 60 to 80 million years ago, roughly, trout 50 to 20 million years ago, and walleye, as we know them now, 1 to 2 million years ago, with probably a distant cousin, or about 10 million years ago. So we're talking about a very long-lived fish that has outlasted the dinosaurs, that we should probably have a responsibility to keep around long past our existence, since they've far exceeded our lifespans. Paddlefish are pretty cool fish. They're enigmatic. I can't say that word. They're cool looking, and they're like sturgeon. People love them. They like to see them. They're neat because they have that awesome paddle. The paddlefish, as I mentioned, is a species of ancient origin, and as such, it has a lot of characteristics that it shares with sharks, such as a spiral valve in the intestine, which I'll go over what that is. Spiracles on the head, which are pores that are theorized to be responsible with balance or breathing. They also have a lot of cartilage in their skeleton. Additionally, they also obtain O2 from the water via ram ventilation and sustained swimming, much like sharks do. The paddlefish paddle. It actually serves a purpose. It's not just a pretty looking thing on the fish. Paddlefish uses specialized electroreceptors that are located in the rostrum or the paddle. The technical name is the rostrum. to detect weak electrical fields that are produced by their prey, primary zooplankton. So they locate their food by this. So it's not so much smell, it's not sight, it's really kind of more electroreception. These receptors are known as ampullae of Lorenzi and are similar to those found on sharks, skates, and rays. They are filter feeders, so they swim with their mouth open. They can get interesting diet items. They eat kind of whatever gets in their way. So primarily zooplankton and stuff, but I have seen them with shad and other fish in their mouth and in their stomachs. They will actively feed on willow droppings and mayflies, and they may get caught by anglers, often by snagging or accident, because they happen to drop something in front of their face. The spiral valve, I couldn't find a good picture of one from paddlefish, so this one's from a nurse shark, but it's similar. The spiral valve primary function is to increase the surface area for nutrient absorption and slow down the passage of food, allowing for more efficient digestion. So as you can imagine, if you're consuming a bunch of plankton that are really tiny creatures and you have to consume a lot of them, you're spending a lot of time doing it, you probably want to extract as much nutrition out of that as possible. And the spiral valve really helps do this by adding more surface area for absorption. Another interesting feature is they're highly fecund, and they were sought after in the early days, and this will be important later on for caviar industry. When I say highly fecund, that means they produce a lot of eggs and a lot of offspring. Specifically, they have 10 to 20,000 eggs per kilogram of fish. And a kilogram, for those who don't want to do the mental math, it's about 2.2 pounds. You're talking 20 to 40,000 eggs per pound of fish. And these fish can reach 50, 60 pounds with ease. So you're talking a lot of egg production. And again, this will be important later on. Now, if we look at the biology, this is also super interesting. Paddlefish occur in open waters of large rivers and lakes, such as Lake Pepin or Lake St. Croix. Adults are filter feeders, as I mentioned before, swimming with their mouths open to pass over their gills. They have potential issues or potential competition with things like invasive carps, silver bighead, the jumping ones, that may be of concern. There's only so much resources out there as far as plankton goes. And, given that carp can dominate the biomass when systems they get, it can be problematic or potentially problematic for things like paddlefish. These species are highly migratory, in some cases migrating hundreds of miles in a couple of weeks. Most male paddlefish mature at 7 to 9 years, and most females mature at 9 to 12 years. Mature adults most likely don't spawn every year. Spawning occurs often in early spring, over gravel bars, temporarily flooded tributaries, when water temperatures reach about 50 degrees. So as you can think about, even though they're highly fecund, producing a lot of eggs, it takes, 10 years for a female or male to first spawn. They may not spawn every year. The average life expectancy commonly is about 20 years. So you're talking maybe 10 years of spawning. They may not spawn every year. That can also be problematic. You need to think about that when managing these species. With the average lifespan being commonly around 20, there are records of them living as much as 50. And in the pictures on the right here of your screen, you see this would be a dentary bone or jawbone. It's sectioned. And fish lay rings down with cycles, so they have periods of fast growth and slow growth. The fast growth being the wide bands, the little white lines there are slow growth in the winter, so it denotes season, so that we can actually age them like rings on a tree. So at the top, you have a 17-year-old female. At the bottom, you have a 22-year-old male. And that's how we determine the age of these fish. For record, just kind of interesting fact, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had a paddlefish they tagged 20 years earlier. When they recaptured it, it had grown 2 inches over that 20 years. So once they get to kind of an adult size or get up to like a bigger size, it does take quite a long time for them to grow much larger. So, even though you see a big fish and you think automatically, oh, that's an old fish, may not actually be as old as you think. There could be quite variable range of ages at any given size. So let's talk about gar, and this is going to be kind of a common theme throughout the talk. I'll talk about paddlefish in the topic, and then I'll jump into the gar. We're going to talk about short-nosed and long-nosed gar, the 2 species that live in Minnesota. There are 7 species total. There's the tropical gar, the Florida gar, the alligator gar, short-nosed, long-nosed, and spotted gar. Long nose snout is more than twice the length of the rest of its skull. The short nose is a shorter, wider. snout. If you see them side by side, it's pretty obvious. The gar are kind of interesting characters. They have a long snout. They have ganoid scales, which I'll talk about what that is. They have a spiral valve intestine, just like the paddlefish do because they're older. And they also have the ability to breathe air, which is super cool. I have two pictures on the left there of a short nose on top and a long nose on the bottom. The one gar on the bottom I'm looking at is probably not the best picture I should use, but it's super cool. That's actually a melanistic gar, which makes it dark. So it's the opposite of albinism. So they have too much pigment instead of not enough pigment. So it turns into this black color, and they're quite rare. So as I mentioned, they have ganoid scales, which are not typical to most fish. So like bass have centenoid, salmon have cycloid, and sharks have something called placoid. But for our purposes, we'll talk about ganoid scales relative to ctenoid or cycloid. Ganoid scales have a thick outer ganoid layer on them, which is like kind of like an enamel-like layer, which makes their scales heavier and much more protective than the typical scales you see on other freshwater species in the Mississippi. Native American tribes in the southeast would make clothing out of this. You can get leather out of this because it is so durable. This is also allows them to have, because they weigh more, the scales weigh more, it allows them to have a much larger swim bladder, which is important for the next slide, as they need to compensate for that increased weight. So the swim bladder size is usually proportional to their position in the water column. Whether or not they're on the bottom, they usually have the smaller one because they don't need it. If they're in the middle of the water column or swimming around actively, they usually have a larger one. They weigh heavier, they have a larger one. If they're smaller, they have a smaller one. So because they're heavier, they have typically a larger one. And this is important because their swim bladder, and having a large one, it's highly vascularized, meaning it has a lot of veins and a lot of blood flow in the swim bladder, which is not typical for most fish. So gar are physostomus, which means they have a connection between their swim bladder and their digestive tract called the pneumatic duct. It actually connects right to their esophagus, which allows them to gulp air and put it into the gas bladder, so O2 rich air, and put it into the gas bladder. And then there's a gas exchange through that thin membrane of the swim bladder and into the blood, just like kind of like a lung would be, and they can actually breathe air in times in which O2 or their gills would function less because of water quality conditions. That's why you can see them and they survive well in backwaters or areas that you see lower O2 in them. While they can functionally breathe air quite well, they're not obligated to, as I mentioned, because they do also have gills. The long-nosed gar and short-nosed gar do differ a little bit in their biology and what they do. Long-nosed gar largely occupy large weedy lakes, reservoirs, backwaters, and slower-moving pools of rivers. They're typically ambush predators, most actively feeding at night, consume plankton and small pelagic invertebrates in the first few weeks, but are obligate piscivores after that. They are gape limited, which means they can only open their mouth so wide. They have a fairly, even though it's a very long mouth, it's a very narrow mouth opening. So, people worry, like, as the manager or researcher, you often hear, oh, they're taking the fish from the bass and the other, predators out there that I like to fish. And yeah, no, because they, bass can suck a much larger fish in than a gar can. They're eating smaller fish. In addition to that, having more than one type of predator out there, having a diverse array of community of predators makes you resilient if one goes. And as we all know, predators are essential for healthy ecosystems and tampering down things like invasive species. So males mature at around 3 years of age and females around 4. Spawning occurs in late May to June, and water temperatures reach about 67 degrees or greater. They usually spawn on weed beds or woody debris, and the young will actually attach to that. They can reach up to 20 inches in their first year of life, but typically for Minnesota, 6 to 8 inches in their first year of life. Maximum lengths are greater than 3 feet. I've seen some closer to 5 feet. They reach ages greater than 20 years, with records reaching 36 years. And I would take that record with a caveat, because really, outside of the last decade and a half, there hasn't been a whole lot of research and work on these fish. There's been spatterings of it, throughout the last 50, 60 years, but not as much as relative to things like walleye, bass, and other fish species. So, if you don't go searching for something, it's hard to find it. And that's not just a Minnesota DNR thing. That's really a industry-wide or a field-wide thing. So any agency, federal, state, regardless, gar research has been pretty minimal. Short-nosed gar inhabit quiet pools of backwater creeks, small to large rivers, swamps, lakes, overflow areas, large streams. So really, really slow water. Far less likely to see them in main channel than, like, say, a long-nosed gar. They often utilize vegetation and submerged overhanging cover, exclusively, kind of like you would expect like a flathead to be underneath the, big tree wad. Similar kind of thing with the short-nosed gar. Similar feeding habits to long-nosed gar. Spawning occurs locally over vegetation or submerged objects. And I should note, while these are not migratory, long-nosed gar are locally migratory, so they will make movements up into areas to spawn. And then they live more than 20 years, but less studied than other species. I should say, even though while the long-nosed gar is migratory, it is far less migratory than the paddlefish again. So just, I'm talking, 10, 20 miles tops versus a couple 100 miles for the paddlefish. So history of management and conservation for paddlefish. And this is where their kind of fish are going to really kind of differentiate in their stories. There's a long history of management and conservation for paddlefish, and an early recognition, relatively speaking, of damage and a need for conservation relative to gar. And it's partly driven by economic reasons, but as we well know, gar are becoming more popular, things like bow fishing, so economic reasons are starting to emerge for gar, which is drawing more attention to them. So paddlefish, importance of paddlefish as a major domestic source of eggs or caviar increased during the early 1800s with the development of depletion of lake sturgeon stocks, resulting in overharvest and mass declines in abundance and pretty rapid declines across the range. And on the right-hand side there, I have what the range of the paddlefish would be in that dark orange, which is basically the Mississippi River Basin, as well as the Missouri River, the Ohio River Basin. Bans in Russian imports in the mid-2000s, I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, also shot up prices on paddlefish roe and caused a little bit of widespread overharvest and population collapses in some of the later fisheries as well. In the 1970s and 80s, jumping back in time again, there's some localized paddlefish populations still supported commercial and recreational harvests, albeit at far lower numbers than you would have historically seen. In 1989, there was a petition that was not granted because most fishery biologists in the fish's historic range thought that several population segments were probably self-sustaining to put these on the endangered species list, but that was denied. They thought they were self-sustaining and were at least stable, albeit at lower levels. In 1992, they were reclassified as a species of special concern, which afforded them additional protections and funding sources to do research and conservation and management on, and afforded protections through CITES. The addition of paddlefish to Appendix 2 of CITES, which is, can't think of the name of the life, but basically they're the animal use sale, people. They monitor sale of animal parts and exotic pets and food and stuff like that. Which this was approved in 1992, and it provided a mechanism for curtail illegal trade of paddlefish and paddlefish products, and supported a variety of conservation plans through those seizures. Listing has also resulted in improved monitoring and of the international trade of paddlefish. So this was a big leap forward for us. And then we took a small step back in 1996 overall, with the species of special concern list being discontinued, which had ramifications for research needs and funding and a bunch of other things. In addition to that, paddlefish management hasn't really been holistic or interjurisdictional. It hasn't been a kind of joining of the states in the matter of the minds of managing agencies, despite the highly migratory behavior of potentially migrating from Minnesota, as far as Missouri or Arkansas, even further at some points. If you see on the left-hand side here, the things that are shaded in dark gray are areas that allowed sport fishing at that time period, and the areas that are lined are the ones that did not. And as you can see, 1983 to 2006, quite little change in where there was allowed fishing. It seems a little odd that a species that isn't functionally just Minnesota's or Wisconsin's, it's also probably the population's also part of Iowa and Illinois, since they do migrate so much, would have two different sets of regulations, us banning them in Illinois and Iowa saying, hey, you got to keep them, or you can keep them. That said, there's quite a diversity array of commercial length limits. This is from another study in 2016 here on the right-hand side, and you can see vastly different regulations, seasons, and what you can do with them, with a handful of closures even. So not a whole lot of cooperation for a species that is functionally all part of one giant stock, and probably a lot of genetic exchange. And just because I caught a fish here in Minnesota, or if I caught it in Illinois, doesn't mean it didn't originate somewhere else. So that's kind of been a focus going forward. If we look at gar, it's kind of a different story. So you have the range maps for the short-nosed gar on the top, and on the bottom here you have the one for long-nosed gar, kind of occupying kind of the same territory with a little bit further wider range for the long-nosed gar, extending down into Florida and out to the Atlantic coast. But a completely different story for management than paddlefish, and kind of a lack of recognition of need of value, and kind of a devaluing of the species. So the photo on the left shows what was dubbed, quote, the gar destroyer, which was an early electrofishing rig that was run with the ill intent compared to modern use. This was run at AC, as high current as they could, which effectively would snap backbones. These days we use DC, which is much safer and gentler on the fish, and that only needed power to cause them to have what is essentially a muscle cramp, so that we can capture them and they can't swim away. The photo on the right had the caption, 16, and this is from Iowa, 1,600 of these fish were removed in one afternoon. Thousands of these fish are destroyed annually by the fisheries department. And this was like a win for the department at the time. Another favorite quote down here, and I'm sure some of you read this, but I really liked the kind of the oddness of this one. Mr. Deputy, and this is from the Missouri Assistant Attorney General, Mr. Deputy in charge of fish, you are informed that it's my wish that you take some of your dynamite and proceed to the Jacks Fork River, and standing on a gravelly bar, cast the shot to kill the gar. Now here's the fun part. But when you execute this command, don't forget the law will demand that while killing gar, you must not harass a single sucker, catfish, or bass. You must obey the instructions without fail or run risk of going to jail while using dynamite. So that's kind of an interesting take. But that's kind of the management, in the past, was get rid of them as many as possible. We don't want them, they're a nuisance. There's no service, there's no need for them. And we've kind of, as everything happens in life, and as fields of study evolve, we've learned that that was probably not the wisest course of action. Going back to paddlefish and talking about current global threats, and I kind of hinted at this, we don't have succinct interjurisdictional management or cooperation. Each state kind of does their own thing, despite the fact that we know that all these fish intermix, and in my population in Minnesota is part of the same stock and potentially the same fish as in Wisconsin, Iowa, and Illinois. So just because we're trying to protect them here because they think they're threatened and they're really valuable, that same fish could go down to Iowa and be harvested or be fished for. This may be well, it's not the only concern. This is likely a larger concern when compounded with other stressors like dams. These fish are highly migratory, as hopefully I've pounded into this talk already. And the Mississippi River is probably one of the most impounded rivers, and this particularly the middle Mississippi, or what we call the upper Mississippi, excuse me, is one of the most impounded sections of river in the country. With 27 locks and dams between, St. Paul and Cape Girardeau, where the confluence with the Missouri and Ohio start. So that's a lot of dams that they have to pass through, and they're not very successful at it very often unless under open river conditions, which is typically a very narrow range of time during the spring when we have flooding. So there's limitations to them getting to access to spawning grounds and can hamper the reproductive output. When you couple this with the potential to be harvested and the potential for them to only spawn in certain years and the late maturing, it doesn't build a very awesome story for their success. Conservation, in turn, because of this thought line is focused on maintaining ability to cross jurisdictional boundaries and make it to spawning grounds with as few limitations as possible. While also in other states like Oklahoma, where they're managing for trophy fisheries. So, primarily I would like to say conservation is focused on trying to get cooperation between states and then trying to maintain and support pathways to get through dams and access through some of these historic barriers that would not have been there, prior to human intervention or modification. Gar threats. Popularity as a sport fish is growing, but is unlikely the only negative stressor. Now, many of you have probably seen this photo. It's not a fun photo for most of us, but this picture documents the spoils of 3 young men on one afternoon on the Minnesota River. These gar were harvested using live scope and a spear. The spears were in murky water and never had visual clarity on what they were spearing. There are over 80 gar in this one photo. The gar were deposited into a farm field as fertilizer, a practice that is currently allowable and not considered wanton waste in Minnesota. Internally, we are looking at some of that stuff now. These young men posted their activities on social media, and their excitement was viewed by many as nothing more than blood sport. And it caught the attention of several influential people, including a couple of legislators, both within and outside of the state, which kind of prompted some changes. As a result, and I'm kind of talking Minnesota, but kind of have to talk about Minnesota here because we're at the forefront of making these changes. As a result, the Minnesota legislature mandated that the DNR to set a bag limit on gar. And given that we had very limited data to go on, and this is ubiquitous in any state, we had little choice but to base this bag limit on social considerations and what most people would find palatable. Therefore, we conducted outreach with citizens, bow fishers, conservationists, angler groups, tribes, and our own enforcement staff, and resulted of this effort was a bag limit of 10 that went into effect March 1st of 2023. Maryland, to my knowledge, is the only other state with a specific long-nosed gar regulation, and it was passed around the same time. However, other states are looking into a more active management gar as well as other rough fish species as interest in fishing for non-game or forage fish grows. And this love for fishing for rough fish or non-typical game fish is growing, which begs to question what a sport fish is anymore. In addition to that, and I kind of highlight this, along with this gar regulation, Minnesota is also the first state to have comprehensive legislation attempting to address rough fish management and conservation. So Minnesota, while this is global status, I'm talking about them so much, it's because we are leading the charge with a lot of states looking to us to see what we're doing as a model and a blueprint for what they're going to do. And make no mistake, there are other states are actively going to be doing something similar. However, historically in Minnesota, management of gar and like many rough fish and paddlefish was very different. In 1899, prohibited from destroying more than 50 fish of all species combined. In 1920, we saw the first bag limits established on game fish, but no limit on other species, which would include gar. Artificial lights allowed for spear and other species. 1927 was the first paddlefish closure. That's when paddlefish became closed to fishing, and it has remained closed to fishing. I should note, in 1922, that's the last record I could find that had allowable harvest of paddlefish, and it was a 15-pound minimum on that fish. In 1930, length limits were placed on rough fish species, 15-inch for buffalo, 16-inch for other species. Also aggregate bag limit, 15 in place. And I should probably define what rough fish means here. And a lot of people think, it has kind of a dirty name to it, junk fish. And really what rough fish means is it means fish that were sold in the rough. So gutted, not filleted, and then sold. That's where that term comes from. 1944, the term rough fish is first used. Regulations started applying to species as a group. 1949, no limit, no closed season. So basically harvest what you can while you can. 2000, regulation emphasized that it was okay to return things rough fish, which would also include gar. And in 2003, we had our first Archer rules for rough fish. So again, bow fishing is, functionally a fairly new field, but a growing sport, and one that we are trying to be proactive to manage for, as well as other things like microfishing and line and reel angling for rough fish, which is gar, which is also growing, just with less attention than say bow fishing. Paddlefish, they're state threatened. Paddlefish was originally listed as a species of concern in Minnesota in 1984, but given the evidence of long-term declines in abundance, distribution, and the continued deterioration of habitat, and their migratory pathways. Species with Florida threatened status in 1996. There's zero allowable catch since the 20s. The biggest inhibitor for this fish species is that standardized sampling gears and methods used by DNR, regardless of state, surveys are relatively ineffective at capturing paddlefish, which makes a difficult choice for us when we have things, when you talk about like carp deterrence on Lock and Dam 5, when you know they make movements through these dams. We have to consider the weight of some of these things. How is this going to affect the paddlefish when we have such limited data and limited resources to get smaller fish? We have a good handle on movement, but to get population estimates, it would be extremely, extremely difficult, if not impossible, to have any sort of confidence in those. Status of long nose and short nose gar. I'm gonna go back a second. I kind of highlighted the counties in which they're in. I don't want to give specific locations just in case anybody would like to go target them. I don't want that to happen, but you're looking at pretty much the Minnesota and the Mississippi River. That's where we're at. For the long nose and short nose gar, the ranges in Minnesota is what it historically would have been. It's, the Minnesota and Missouri River down here in the southwest corner, and the Mississippi River. Not, pretty standard. Not really seeing, any range expansion or really decrease that I'm aware of. So relatively stable in their distribution. However, there is ambiguity in some of our data. So this just as an example, we have catch data here. So we have, this is long nose gar catch per unit effort, which is in this case on the Y, fish per hour of electrofishing. And we have year on the X, which is the year that the sample is taken, for pool 4 on the left and pool 8 on the right. The individual dots are not so much meaningful at any given point, but the trends is what you should look at, the dotted line. And you see a fairly flat trend, which, all right, they're kind of flat, not really doing much of anything, but you see a much different scenario in pool 8, even though they're not functionally that far away. In addition to that, you see things like that really high point on pool 4 around 2017, and you see a precipitous drop off. It's difficult to interpret these sort of things and have an understanding of what this means without additional information. Catch per unit effort catch rates are influenced by weather, they're influenced by gear, who's sampling them. There's a lot of information that goes into them that puts a lot of caveats on them. So it can be difficult to set regulations on this alone, which, as part of the rough fish legislation and some of the stuff we're doing, we determined that we needed more information. And I'm about to talk about some of the stuff we're doing going forward to try to fill some of these gaps so that we can be more responsible in management, both as an agency and as a field of fisheries managers. So looking forward, what do we got going on? So we do a lot of movement ecology since paddlefish are hard to kind of get. We try to focus on maintaining access and ability to make passage to migratory grounds, evaluating where they might be spawning, what they might be doing. We do this through telemetry networks. And we have, through cooperation with numerous other agencies, we have the ability to track paddlefish tagged in St. Peter all the way down to New Orleans if we want, and up into West Virginia. And we do share data with all these state agencies, and we have records of this, so we can get a much larger understanding of what this population or stock, I should say multiple populations as part of a larger stock, are doing, and who goes where and what, and how we should be managing these fish and where we need to be protecting. So that's what we're kind of actively looking at. We look at things like when they might pass, which has implications for if we want to put things like barriers to stop carp from passing through the same dam. So we have evaluations of when they're passing. So in here, the square pegs and the yellow triangles are times in which they would pass. And then the blue line is discharge. So it kind of notes when discharge is up. So water flowing heavily, flooding, that's when they try to make passage. That's because the dam gates are open and they can actually swim upriver. We also have interesting things like what we see here on the Y is depth, and this is time on the X. These points are depths that we found paddlefish in Lake Pepin. And we see this pattern in open water that kind of go all over the place. But once under ice, there's a slow migration up to the surface and then a drop off back to when open water comes up. And then a slow migration up during winter and a drop off back in the summer, and they're kind of all over the place. And it's kind of the first documentation of this, and we don't really know why it's doing it. And I haven't found a good answer from any other biologists, but this might have some sort of implications for conservation and management that we need to be aware of. In addition, some of this telemetry work and multi-partner collaboration has been used, and this is a paper I was part of, as well as some other Minnesota biologists, to look at flooding and dam operations to facilitate rapid upstream migrations of native invasive fish species in a large regulated river. So the Mississippi, so we looked at all the way down from Lock and Dam 2 all the way down to Lock and Dam 20, looking at paddlefish and silver and bighead carp movements. And seeing what the timing, how likely they're moving, is there any similarities, is there a way we can manipulate things to allow one and not the other to go, and kind of just setting some baselines for this. For GAR, I'm specifically doing a lot of research on this with age and growth. I'm trying to fill in demographics, population status information on these mortality rates to try to get a better handle on what the population structure looks like. We also have cooperations with Dr. Solomon David, who is frankly, the GAR guy in the world, the world's foremost expert who just moved and started working for University of Minnesota. We have cooperations going with him, where we're trying to get a handle and fill in some of those knowledge gaps that are left by just having catch data. With that, I would like to share some more of that information. Just unfortunately, I'm not at the point to do that. But with that, I will take any questions that anybody might have. I'm sure there are several. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Devin. That's a ton of information. We do have some questions coming in, but I do want to just remind everyone that if you do have questions, go ahead and just type them in the Q&A. And we're going to spend a chunk of time here answering all of those. The first one that came up was from Pierce. And when you were talking about sort of distribution, Pierce was wondering if we have any understanding of why they're only located in Lake Michigan as opposed to any of the other Great Lakes.
Oh, you saw them way up there? I don't quite frankly know, to be honest with you. And that one record that was on there, I'm not sure if that was a mistake or not. I do not go to Lake Michigan. I'm a river guy. But if you'd like to follow up, my email is devin.oliver@state.mn.us, and I can get an answer for you. But I am not familiar with that. They should just kind of be in the Mississippi River Basin.
Mm-hmm. There was another question that came up on one of the slides, and I think I was able to answer this. I've always referred to it as CITES, C-I-T-E-S. Is that correct?
Sorry, I misspoke. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I misspoke.
Do you want to talk a little bit more about what that agency is and sort of their relationship in this particular species?
In this case, they basically monitor the illegal trade of paddlefish caviar. That's really the concern there. You know, with the shutdown of Russian beluga caviar in the U.S., you know, caviar specifically has to be from sturgeon or paddlefish origin for it to be caviar in the U.S. So it's a designation thing. So when you have a lucrative business that suddenly disappears, it causes bad actors to try to go do something. And so they're kind of the monitors for that, and they're the ones that kind of enforce that internationally and have the authority for that kind of stuff. And they also provide funding and value for protection of these species.
Absolutely. Well, while we're waiting for some more questions to come in, I was just going to ask you kind of on a personal level. I think you've talked a lot about this research and sort of the interstate and interagency cooperation that's sort of required to get it moving forward. Can you talk to us a little bit more about like some of the things you're most excited about personally when it comes to sort of the agency cooperation and the state of Minnesota kind of leading a lot of this research?
Yeah, so we are leading a lot of research, and we have a lot of outpouring to work with us on things. So that we're sharing telemetry data actively. You know, that's one paper we had there with Telemetry Network working on it. I'm doing rough fish work with Red Horse, where I'm getting cooperation from Wisconsin and Illinois on some of those samples. For regulations and what we're doing, you know, when you go to conferences and you talk about this stuff, they're like, oh yeah, we're looking into this, we're looking at you guys for this, but you know, we're trying to set up collaborations to do science, and actually it's getting the ball rolling forward for some of this now because it's becoming a pressing need, and we're being really kind of proactive on this. You know, things like GAR, you know, we've seen the collapse with paddlefish. It's happened, right? The economic value is there. The economic value of GAR is growing. Well, I'm not saying that it is going to collapse. The potential is there under the right circumstances for it to happen. We don't know what's going to happen with climate change. We don't know what happens if, you know, with dam operations, anthropogenic effects, with human influence sprawl. So it's best to get a handle on some of these things, especially to get like a baseline. Even if things are fine, I think everybody kind of agrees across the board that getting an understanding of what the growth rates and mortality rates are now, potentially before a problem or before it gets too bad, so that we have something to compare against. It's hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you've been, kind of scenario, is essential. There's a large project through USGS and some of the funding through the long-term resource monitoring program, which is the gold standard for river monitoring, which we're part of in the state, and all the states on the upper Mississippi are part of, all the way down through Missouri, where they do standardized sampling in the same way across the river. They did a big population demographic study for a whole bunch of fish species, right down to little emerald shiners, looking at growth, mortality, to try to establish some of these baselines. And it's really showing the need for some of this. They did some natal recruitment stuff. They're looking at where are my fish, or are they coming from the Minnesota? And there's records of fish in Illinois originating in the Minnesota River. There's fish originating in Illinois that are up here now. So, it's really building this body support so that we can go to legislators and some of these holdouts for state agencies, be like, hey, this is important. Here's why it's important. I can remember, Ohio being sued by New York State when I was younger for, acidification of the Adirondack lakes, right? Because one state was affecting another state. I don't know the legal ramifications, but if one state is taking out another state's fish, it seems like somebody would try to do something about that eventually. So, cooperation is essential. We do it with pallet sturgeon, we do it with shovel-nose sturgeon. We're catching up with other things, and it's just getting buy-in and showing evidence. And whenever you're doing any of this stuff, you want to do it with science-based evidence, because otherwise, you go into legal standings and be like, why are you doing this? And be like, well, we felt like it. And it doesn't really hold merit. But if you can go like, here are the numbers, this is why we're doing this, it really holds a lot of weight.
Absolutely. Well, and I think a lot of people just are interested in it in the fisheries. These fish that individually can be more than 100 years old, that travel these great distances. It's a whole new group of fish that people are learning about. That's a little bit different than our sort of traditional quote unquote sports fish.
Yeah, and garter are fun to catch if you haven't done it. Sinking a hook in the mouth can be a little bit difficult, but there are ways of doing it, and they are fun. They are good to eat. If you have to make them in the fish case, they have tiny little bones, but they are tasty. You can eat them. I've eaten quite a few of them.
Well, Hunter had a question about if you were to catch a paddlefish, is that something that you should let a state biologist know about, or something that you should contact a conservation officer about?
If you accidentally catch one, and it does happen, and stuff to catch happens. First thing to know is if you're not targeting them, you're not in trouble. It's best to be honest, especially if it dies. They are easily stressed. That's one of the reasons we have trouble sampling. Things like electrofishing gear really negatively affect these things, so we can't go out and just electrofishing them. If we're using gill nets, they kind of get in them. We have to use very large mesh gill net, otherwise we end up with everything in there, and it's just not a good use of anybody's time, and they still can get stressed. So they may pass away. If they do, yes, please let somebody know, because we can take information. I can take a dentary bone off that and get an age on it. The sooner the better. I can take sex information. I can take fecundity off that to get it. Recruitment, recruitment being how many eggs they're producing to offspring potentially. That has ramifications for determining if we're having recruitment overfishing. Are we losing more? Not recruitment overfishing, but recruitment loss relative to mortality. Are we losing more than we can produce? Are they dying off before they reach their full growth potential? There's a whole bunch of things that we can get out of just that one fish. I can take, the dentary bone and send it off for analysis and determine natal origin based off of water chemical signatures. There's so much information I can get off one dead fish, preferably fresh. Dealing with 5-day-old paddlefish is not a pleasant thing. I've done it. Do not like doing it, but I can even get information off that in some circumstances, as long as it's not been tore apart. If it's been tore apart, let somebody know. But if you caught it recently, if it passed, let us know. We'll get information. If it's live and fine, best to get it back in the water and swimming again. And if I know the urge to get a picture with it is high because it's cool. I would avoid getting a picture with it because it does require ram ventilation. They are easily stressed. If you get one, I would just keep it in the water, unhook it, and get it back. Maybe even if you want, take that quick cell phone shot in the water, I guess. But, I wouldn't even do that. I would just get it back in the water and just be safe about it.
Absolutely. Well, and we're really fortunate. We're at a time of the year where if you want to see these fish in person, the state fair is coming up right around the corner, starting August 21st. And I know that they, for many years, have had both paddlefish and both species of gar in the state fish pond at the DNR building. So if you want to see them in person, come visit us when you're at the fair, because it's a great opportunity to kind of just see them up close and personal.
And
Jennifer, oh yeah, go ahead.
there are states where you can harvest them and catch them legally, and it's completely sustainable in the way they're doing it. Um, they are good to eat. They are cool fish. So if you do actively want to catch one, not the same the person that asked the question does, if you do, go to one of those states and try it. But do not do it here because we don't have the state population to do that.
Sounds like a good reason to travel somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
Jennifer did have a question. It seems very specific about the lock and dam system. Wondering if you personally had any recommendations on how a carp barrier on Dam 5 would work to allow migratory movement of native fish versus keeping invasive carp limited in their movement. To Jennifer, it seems pretty tricky. High water, migratory movement of fish. I'm guessing this is
It's extremely tricky. Yes.
Yeah.
So despite some information out there, most carp pass through the gates of the dam, not through the lock chamber. So putting a deterrent on the lock chamber doesn't necessarily do a lot. It's a functional reduction probably of 2% passage roughly gets through there without a barrier. Probably talking about 1.5 passage to 1% passage if you put a barrier, a deterrent on it. So you're talking most of it going through the gates. You're talking about having a modified gate operation, which, to be honest, is a hard ask from you, Army Corps, who's looking at managing things for flood control and navigation. That's the primary purpose of those. So you might be able to do some things, some manipulating flows. Functionally, you could try to get them to congregate elsewhere. I don't think that would work very well. Trap and transport, you could possibly do, where you'd have to transport and separate. But functionally, there's not really a good option. And again, in my personal opinion, they're going to go through the gates unless you do something about that. You can't do anything about it for carp. They've been up here since the early 2000s. We have records of them up here. They're not reproducing that we know of. The invasion front is way down in Illinois. It's one of those things, let's do it if we need to be proactive for deterrence, but let's keep in mind that the paddlefish are here. They have historically struggled. Let's not do something that kind of wrecks their day in lieu of a potential problem. If we can get a kind of code balance, which we're kind of trying to work through now as an agency, great. I'm all for it. Like, let's do something protective to prevent an issue. Okay, we can do that. But again, not at the sacrifice of paddlefish, which help keep our ecosystems healthy, which is the #1 defense you can have against an invasive species, is having a diverse predator community, one, so something like gar, and a diverse community in general and competition for them. So if you have a diverse and healthy paddlefish population that's consuming food, it's hard for those other fish to get established in the first place, or other organisms get established in the first place.
One of the common questions that I know I get, especially when I'm out at the state fair and other other places, especially from people who are interested in paddlefish and how we study them, is this idea of telemetry and actually the mechanics of the trackers and how we actually get them into the paddlefish. Can you talk a little bit more about that process and
Yeah,
what
so
it
I've
looks
done
like
a
at
whole
the
lot of
DNR?
this. It's one thing I'm an expert in. So you can do 2 methods. You can backpack them, which is functionally they're on certain fish. Their dorsal fin has rays that protrude down into their flesh. You can basically put 2 wires through the fin rays and lock them in back there. Doesn't really cause any harm to them. They kind of swim around it, eventually falls off. Or 2, you can anesthetize them. We use a derivative of clove oil, which basically knocks them out, just like you would go under anesthesia, so they feel no pain, and you surgically implant them. We try to follow a 5 to 7% rule, so no more than 5 to 7% of their body weight. Tag goes in, you close them up. It sends out an acoustic signal, in some cases a radio signal if you're in a smaller system. We have a receiver, which looks like a little tube in the lake that just sits there and perpetually monitors for any noise in a certain range of sound. and it's nothing that's going to be produced by anything else other than those tags. And when it hits on there, we know it's in the location. You can position those receivers in a certain way so that you get overlapping ranges of those receivers, because it's not perfect, it's not 100%. So you can kind of triangulate. So if one picks it up here and one picks up here, you kind of know where the overlap is. You can also do manual tracking with a hydrophone, which looks like a little speaker on the end of a stick. So you can actually drive around and sit right on top of it. Basically, drive around until you're like right on top of the fish, and it will get much louder. You know when you're on a fish, because you have to turn that volume down because it's blowing out your eardrums. That's how we kind of do some of those things. And you can link all that to GPS points, and then we can also do things like side scan sonar and link it to habitat. Some of those tags have temperature sensors in them and depth sensors in them, mortality sensors in them. There's all sorts of cool things you can do with these. They are very expensive though.
Yeah. So I'm not seeing any other questions come in. I think we can probably start to wrap up early here. But before we do, though, I just wanted to make sure you didn't have anything else you want to share. Is there something that you personally are just really excited about to learn more in the next year in regards to this research? Like what's most fascinating to you?
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to some of the outcomes of my research on gar and paddlefish population status, what they're doing, and taking next steps on some of that. I will say, I do work for the agency now, but I have worked in another agency and worked around a little bit. And I'm very excited to work for Minnesota DNR and be on the forefront and being proactive for this, because it is a problem that other agencies have to deal with. And if they don't deal with it, they're going to be behind and putting out fires functionally, trailing with it later. So it's nice to be proactive and on the forefront of this, and working for an agency that values, differing opinions, science, and trying to be a leader, not just wait to see what everybody else is going to be doing. Really, yeah, that's all I can say. I'm just excited.
Yeah.
Working here and that we're doing this, because having worked in other agencies, they're just into the putting out fire game, and you're just potentially putting out fires, and then you're always trying to solve a problem that needed an answer 5 years ago. In this case, maybe we needed it 5 years ago, but we're trying to get answers for the future now rather than 5 years from now. And I think, like anything else, we got to start somewhere, and, at least we're doing that.
Yeah, your enthusiasm prompted a couple more questions. Jennifer was wondering, and I hope I'm saying this right, is it placoid scale?
Placoid?
Placoid, yep. Can you talk a little bit about the placoid scale on sharks and how and it working differently than scales on freshwater fish?
They're like sandpaper, and I've actually held sharks out of gill nets. They're god awful to handle. They're very raspy, and that bump on them actually helps break up the water and makes them more hydrodynamic. It kind of smooths out the water and breaks up the water resistance on them, which you don't get on the chinoid scales and the ganoid or the cycloid scales.
And Kenny is just wondering if we have any information about the longest documented migration of a paddlefish from Minnesota southward.
I know of at least one that was 300 miles. I don't know anything more than that, but 300 miles is quite long. That was.
Do you know the time period?
Within the course of a couple of years, I believe, but I don't remember how quickly I've seen other fish, of similar species do those kind of movements in like a week. So it wouldn't surprise me. Off the top of my head, I don't remember.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Devin, for sharing all this information with us today. We do have a recording of this, and I know that that Dr. Alvers provided his contact information if you have any follow-up questions. But we do have a recording of this if individuals want or other individuals want to go have a chance to see it. We'll post this on the MOS website, hopefully within a week or so that other individuals can see it. Next Wednesday's session, we're going to be talking a little bit about hunting teal in the early season. So join us for that if you're interested in that hunting process and learning a little bit more. And I also wanted to let you know that our fall MOS series is going to be coming out here sometime in September. So keep an eye out for registration for those sessions as well if you're interested in learning about a variety of topics coming up here in the fall season. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Devin, did you have any final words?
Nope.
All right, sounds great. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see everyone soon.